At the moment, the American right is at a standstill. There are significant questions about American identity and how that interacts with economic issues. And one of the many recent episodes of this tension has been the H1B visa debate, which really erupted over the Christmas of last year, but still continues into the new year to inform conversations around immigration, around economics, around national character, and also around deeper issues, such as the nature of nationhood, the nature of man. What kind of creature is man? The importance of community and society as it relates to the overall health and well-being of an economy, so on and so forth. And there are a few viewpoints to this effect that I think are limiting the conversation and presenting very narrow ways of seeing the H1B issue and the broader issues I just talked about. So, in this video, I will be providing an analysis of the H1B debate, and I will be going over as I mentioned, the three positions that assume a lot of things about the debate that are not necessarily true, but also get some things right. And I will be offering my own solution to the many different angles and problems that happen to be at play here in this particular issue. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. Happy New Year. I'm Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our venture is successful. Because this channel is not simply about giving you entertainment. This channel is fundamentally about providing you edification. And if I have made you think at least once in the course of these videos, I've achieved my mission, I've done my job, and I think that would be, if more people in our country think, the better off our country and the West as a whole will be. So be sure to, again, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, and be sure also to let me know if you disagree with me or not in the comment section down below. Thank you so much, and now please enjoy the video. So, as President Trump here in America was announcing his cabinet picks, he announced a particular cabinet pick that made some people on the sort of MAGA right, if you want to call them that, a bit upset. A man called Sriram Krishnan, an Indian man, to be his advisor on a particular level of policy, particularly to be his advisor on issues of artificial intelligence, which I think is a massive genre of problems that President Trump will have to tackle, and I think the West will have to tackle as time goes on. And I actually have a video coming up about the sort of challenges, the moral and civilizational challenges that artificial intelligence is going to be posing to us here in our country and going forward. That's a different story, different day. But his announcement as this advisor sparked a lot of furor amongst online influencers and amongst a lot of people on the online right in general concerning the issue of H1B visas and how they relate to jobs in the tech industry, because this individual in particular happens to be a very vocal supporter of H1B visas. So this caused a massive debate, which really brought out, again, I mentioned a furor strongly against H1B visas. And this position framed this matter as a matter of being for America first or being for America last. And I'll get more into the substance of the positions in general. But then as the debate progressed, more people got involved in it. So Elon Musk, as many of you may know, got involved in it and was actually quite supportive at the start of H1B visas. Then as backlash ramped up, he began to slowly scale back, or at least I would say refine and adjust his positions to be a little bit more conciliatory towards the criticisms he was getting. Vivek Ramaswamy famously made a post on Twitter that I will discuss later that basically talked about and argued that H-1B visas are a solution to a sort of mediocrity that exists within American culture that is not producing highly skilled workers. And a lot of folks, I think, took this in a very ill-informed and narrow-minded way. I have my own opinions about this, and I will get into them in a moment. And they have used this, I think, to negatively impact his image in the conservative movement, which I think is absolutely a shame. And of course, President Trump himself has come out in support of H-1B visas. So, which funnily enough, he actually got the least amount of backlash out of anyone else. But this debate, as it has formed and has progressed, has come to encompass at least three primary positions. I will label each position in my own way, but I will explain what they mean. The first position is I call the provincialist position. This position says that H-1B visas are a symptom of an overall illness that besets the American legal system. It is an illness that allows foreign workers, foreign people to become impactful in American society by means of immigration, whether that be through visas or whether that be through legal immigration. The provincialist position basically says that legal immigration, not just illegal, but legal immigration, is actually fundamentally bad because it has a bunch of negative impacts on social cohesion. It displaces the native peoples of a country, and economically, it causes a sort of wide job market outside of the country to be preferenced for pickings, which leaves American workers in the dust and disadvantaged. This is the provincialist position. This position also encompasses a wide variety of views on the issue of America First. For the people that hold this position, America First is not necessarily a matter of ideology or values. America First is primarily a matter of what, in their view, best advances what they see as America, and that is the particular area or the particular kinds of people that they see in America being impacted by certain kinds of things. So, for example, someone that holds the provincialist view would view somebody that lives in old still country in Pennsylvania, or that has a family that was working in the coal mines, as more authentically American than they would someone who lives in Silicon Valley or Malibu, who would be considered to be tech oligarchs or tech elites. That is basically a gist of the provincialist position. Then there is the centrist position. The centrist position on the H1B visa issue says that H1B visas as a program is flawed. There is some merit for foreign workers to be involved in the American economy, but H1Bs, as it is written, as is legislated, is fundamentally flawed and should either be drastically changed or abolished, and other systems should be preferenced, like the O1B visa, which measures genius and extraordinary skill. This is actually the position of Elon Musk, of Ron DeSantis, of a lot of different people that have taken on this particular issue. Then you have the universalist position. Now, this position is not necessarily very well represented in our current discourse because of how relatively extreme it is in our current times. But back in the late 1980s, this position was actually the standard for how immigration was seen by a lot of people on the institutional right. The universalist position basically says that open borders, literally, they say that open borders is the best form of economic mitigation. It is the best form of immigration disposition because open borders allows a nation's economy to perpetually benefit from the economic skills of other people. And so policy, according to the universalist position, should not be based on if it affects community X or community A in a very concrete way. All immigration should be assumed to benefit and enrich the country by virtue of bringing in people that have other skills or other talents that we may not have here, in their view, into the country. So the de facto position of the universalist idea, as it relates to H1Bs, is that H1Bs and any other kind of immigration is net positive because it fills a need that we may have, and it should happen in perpetuity with no limits. This was a position that was taken by the Wall Street Journal as recently as the late 1980s, when they were arguing for what they called a supply-side approach to immigration. Those of you who are familiar with Ronald Reagan will know about supply-side economics and all that kind of stuff as well. So, of these three positions, I think all of them touch on some very important things, but I also think that all of them are fundamentally flawed. And I think I have to work through the provincialist position first, because the provincialist position is actually perhaps most egregious in its errors and its flaws. So the provincialist position treats the first flaw is that it treats the idea of America First as a narrow idea that is rooted not necessarily in the values or the principles of our country, but is instead rooted in a very regionalistic sense, a very limited sense, a very, I would even say, mundane sense of the word America. In other words, America is being seen not necessarily as a country that is built upon a certain foundation that implies certain ideas and principles that people, by virtue of being here, must adopt, in other words, Americanism being a worldview, they instead believe that America is just this place with no necessarily we just say abstract quality that then therefore means that any foreign influence, even if it's people that naturally naturalize here and become full citizens, would be negative because it displaces native Americans. This is literally the language that they use. Well, first of all, America First is not a provincialist doctrine because America is not a provincialist nation. America is a nation, as I mentioned before, founded upon universal moral principles. And if you want to understand America, you must first understand those foundations, which go all the way back to the beginning of the modern era in natural law theory, that go all the way back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, that go all the way back to Adam Smith's ruminations upon how civil society should develop, which go all the way back to the notion that societies work best when they come from the bottom up, not from the top down, which go all the way back to the notion that man is a self-controlling individual that can act with will, and him acting with will in pursuit of virtue actually is good for the rest of society, because a free society requires a virtuous people, which is, by the way, a quote that a lot of the provincialists like to quote, but they don't actually follow it to its logical conclusions. These Americanism goes all the way back to these foundational core ideas. And these ideas apply anywhere, not just within the geographic borders of our country, even though these ideas are not appreciated by everyone in every other place. And these ideas cannot necessarily be applied in every other place, because these ideas do require a particular historical and cultural context to be rendered intelligible towards political and social order. Having said that, just because a car requires a driver to move, does not mean the car's ability to move, its capacity to move, is dependent on the driver. Its capacity to move is dependent on the proper ordering of its functions and parts. It's dependent on it having wheels that have air in them. It's dependent on it having an engine. It's dependent on a bunch of other things. And oftentimes this position conflates capacity with the other factors that would motivate it. And that's the problem. So when you say, for example, that foreign workers hurt Americans because they're foreign workers, not only is this fallacious, because you're essentially saying someone's origin point should establish their moral goodness, which is just the genetic fallacy. It's not true whatsoever. But you're also saying that someone who was born in America is inherently more American than a foreigner. Is this true? Do you see the kids that are on college campuses that are saying that America is evil, who have had several generations of their family live and die in this country? You cannot simply treat being an American as being born on a certain piece of land or being born to a certain community, because America is an exceptional nation within the stream of history. This is why Oswald Spengler had a very hard time understanding us, so much so that he said that our country was not a civilization. It was instead a micro thing, an offshoot of Europe that was an aberration that would die out eventually. And thankfully, since his day has passed, he's been wrong, and hopefully he remains wrong. That's the first issue with the provincialist position. The second issue, and this is more generally a problem with all the positions, is that they mix economics with politics. When you mix economic consideration with political consideration, you misunderstand the nature of both. So when you try to make, for example, the amount of workers that a business can employ in a particular country a political issue, you will get political results. Now, many of you may say, well, Christian, it was already a political issue, which is why we're having this debate. That's correct. And that's the problem. Because all of these positions assume that this has to remain a political issue, rather than actually challenging the premise of why the H1B visa debate is even a political issue whatsoever. See, when you are when you're in a hermetically sealed circle, and all you know is that circle, you will never think to go outside the circle. If you're a fish that lives inside of water, you never question why you're in water, because the water is all you know. Well, a lot of people are swimming through the waters of our culture and the waters of our politics, assuming that the environment around them has to necessarily be so, without actually questioning why it is so. The H1B visas became a political issue when they were established by the Immigration Act in the early 1990s. And this act established several visas, not just the H1B visas, but it also established caps for foreign workers that were brought in under the H1B visas. These caps have been lowered, according to the American Immigration Council, by each passing year. So the caps have not gone up. But in any case, this act was the genesis of the politicization, so to speak, of the foreign worker. And the problem is this. When a business is trying to make an economic consideration, they are looking at balance sheets. They're looking at comparative and absolute advantage, that there are some things that we do very well that we have to continue to capitalize on, but there are other things that we do not do very well that other people may be able to help us with. And if that happens, that actually benefits my firm, benefits my business, and therefore benefits my country, because downstream of that would be production. Downstream of that would be me continuing to provide supply in my country. The laws of economics are distinct from the laws of politics. When a politician looks at an issue, he's more worried about, how will this win me votes? He's more worried about, will this further the ideology represented by the institution I represent, whether it be the Democratic Party or Republican Party? He's more worried about, is this going to make me look good in the eyes of my constituents? He's more worried about a bunch of ancillary things that have actually nothing to do with the proper role of politics in the first place, which is to simply have a process of governance ordered by moral principles and enshrined within the Constitution, and also enshrined within the common law history of the United States, not to be this sort of arbiter of the affairs of others at the behest of somehow rendering himself favorable in the eyes of others. And yet, when the two domains mix, they cannot fulfill their proper functions, and they become zombified versions of themselves that are then taken for granted by the people who see utility in them being zombified versions, and their original quality degrades. So this entire debate presumes a connection that is the exact problem. If there was no Immigration Act of the 1990s, there would be no H1B visa debate that's tearing apart the American right now, and tearing apart more generally some people who have a certain perspective about this, because it would not be a political consideration, it would be a private consideration. Now, obviously, immigration policy as a whole has to be a political issue, because the people you let into the country on a permanent basis will ultimately shape the identity of the country. But H-1B visas are not permanent. In fact, they are 3 years to 6 years at most, and then they expire. Unless, in fact, 6 years is the absolute limit. So again, it doesn't really work seeing it on a political basis. Another issue that I see happen with all of these different perspectives, particularly, especially the provincialist one, is that it presumes a structural view of man that pits the American worker against the foreign worker, without actually realizing that the American worker and the foreign worker have the ability, not just the ability, but have the complete necessity of working together for the good of the nation. The structural view of man basically says that man is defined by the institutions that he is surrounded with. He's defined by his churches. He's defined by his family. He's defined by his friends. He's defined by his associates. And the truth is, the kernel of truth that I mentioned is that man is indeed influenced by all these things, but we're not defined by these things. We are defined by a combination of our intellection, our free will, our habits, all of which form our character, and then how we use our character to impact the world around us. And yes, those things I mentioned may very well influence your character, but they do not necessarily control or define you. But the structural view of man believes that man is like this automaton that can be tinkered with and messed with and tuned up and tuned down, and therefore we should undertake political decisions on the basis of this flawed understanding of man. Which is why a lot of people in the provincialist position will say, well, why don't we just train Americans to do these jobs? We don't need foreign workers to do these jobs. And they'll also say that this is simply cheap labor. This is simply cheap labor for foreign companies who don't want to pay the extra expense of hiring Americans. Well, first of all, the reason you can't train Americans to do certain things is because you can't provoke greatness by virtue of law. Greatness has to first have seeds that are within inside of you. Then those seeds have to be nurtured by an accommodating culture and also in accommodating institutions. Now here's the problem. The institutions we are in, that we are surrounded by, education-wise, are filled with standardized, broad, abstract goals that are reflective of a mentality towards education that says that pupils should be robots and they should be educated into this society, or they would say acculturated into this society by virtue of indoctrination, as opposed to having a more traditional sense of education, which America had within the early 19th century, which basically says that the pupil should be concerned about general matters and general ideas, whether it be history, reading, economics, mathematics, that will help him apply his skills to life in a way that makes most sense for a particular environment. No, well, the progressive education completely turned this around and said, no, there has to be a forceful birthing of the pupil into a particular social mentality by virtue of these standardized systems. This is what John Dewey did. This is what Woodrow Wilson was doing. This is what all these different architects of these, I would call, anti-ideas were doing, and they succeeded. And so we live in an environment, we live in the downstream consequence of their machinations, and we're having to deal with what they did to us all those years ago. So when you take, again, a fish does not recognize it's in water. This is the water that we as Americans are surrounded in. So when you take that and you realize the environment many of our brightest are swimming in, the environment that I swam in as a product of the public school system, as a survivor rather, of the public school system, you will then therefore realize why that number is like it is. You will then therefore realize why there is not an emphasis on skill the way there is in China or the way there is in other parts of Asia. It's not because Americans are inherently dumb or not good enough. Of course not. It's because the institutions and the support systems and the mentality surrounding education, which basically just meant to produce automatons to make someone else rich, the 9-to-5 mentality which is instilled in you from cradle to the grave in this country, that does not produce a culture of people that are visionaries. That does not produce a culture of people that think beyond step 1 or step 2. It produces the culture of people that want to get through step 1 and step 2 to see what happens after the next step and to be guided by the system. This is why the student loan crisis is a crisis, because it is a crisis instilled by poor mentality surrounding education and borrowing to get an education. So, the structural view of man, if anything, has been destructive to the future of the American pupil. In using it to attack the H1B issue is going to do nothing more than continue to lead us into a pathway of perpetual error. But as I mentioned, you can't compel these things out of people. You can't compel a gift out of a person. But this also doesn't mean that Americans can somehow not do these high-skilled jobs, and it doesn't mean that H1Bs are inherently a tool or an opponent or a foe of the American worker. So the counter to this would be that H1Bs are somehow a form of cheap labor. Now, when I hear this, I oftentimes think to myself, well, what do you mean by cheap? Because cheap is rather relative. Because if you're using the word cheap in the way that people generally use the word cheap, then I don't think you can say H1Bs are cheap labor. You know why? Because H1Bs not only come with a bunch of regulatory tape, they come with a bunch of fees and costs associated. And on top of those fees and costs, the salary that the median H1B visa holder makes, which is well over 6 figures, by the way, adds to those costs. So it would seem to me that in order to believe that H1B visas are cheap labor, you have to believe a number of things that make no sense. Number one, you have to believe that companies are inherently hurting their bottom line because they hate America, or they hate the American worker. You have to prove that. That's extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the case does not seem likely that it's happening, because if this is a business decision, as the claim suggests that it is, then the business decision, the logical one, would not be to hire from India or hire from China, which is the two biggest countries where H1Bs come from, but instead to hire here at home, because the cost of getting a worker here at home may just be doing a job interview and burning some electricity in the interview room or on the computer, as opposed to paying, according to this chart that I have here from Forbes, $50,000 for an initial application fee, for processing, for an extension of the worker being here, and for a green card. Not only that, but as I mentioned before a moment ago, the median H1B worker in America makes around $108,000, whereas the median American worker makes $45,000, about. We'll round up some numbers. So my question is, if this is a matter of cheap labor, then why in the world are companies inherently hurting their bottom line to hire people that are more expensive? Now, there's an interesting argument from Eric Weinstein. that essentially says that back in the 90s, the H1B program, particularly as it relates to STEM, the sciences, technology, and medicine, was created to create this permanent underclass of academic workers and researchers who would be subservient to people who already had power within the scientific establishment, within the university establishment, and then bring in these outside workers that would be more easily able to control, and they could be used as a political leveraging pawn for the current, underclass that was created by this policy. Now, I've reviewed Weinstein's arguments, and a lot of them seem based on sound empirical assertions. But there's a problem. When you try to apply, for example, how a policy was crafted in the 90s and the conditions that surrounded it, which preceded the 80s and the 70s, to how it is today and the impacts of it today and the variety of industries that use it today, you can't do that. There's a disanalogous nature to that assertion. So I'll very well admit, government has colluded with private interest to craft immigration policy that does not benefit anyone except those private interests, which, by the way, on its own is immoral and shouldn't happen, which is why I believe that immigration reform is necessary. But I also don't believe that all foreign workers, therefore, are just serving private interest and necessarily hurt the American worker, especially when you consider the fact that when H1B visa wages have risen, so have American pay raises. So, for example, as the American Immigration Council notes in their study, between 2003 and 2021, the median wage of H1B workers grew by 52%. But in that same period, the median wage of all United States-based workers increased by 39%. In 2019, 78% of all employers who hired H-1B workers wages and offered wages to H-1B visa holders, the wages were higher than what the Department of Labor had determined to be the prevailing wage for a particular kind of job. Again, why in the world are tech companies paying, or companies in general paying these people to do more work? They must believe that these people offer more value than what they can find domestically. Whether that's true or not is not for me to decide. I don't know. But obviously, the producer, the one who is producing value for the economy, believes that. And that can be a decision that is made independent of a political calculus. But if it's made in conjunction with an economic calculus, then you cannot possibly say it's cheap labor because it's not cheap whatsoever. It's just an absolute non sequitur. So that's another problem. But the other issue is that, again, I mentioned this before, that a lot of people assume that native-born Americans are somehow more American than people that are not native-born Americans, who may have come here and assimilated because they're native-born Americans. But I think this is a artifact of an old world mentality, an old world perspective of seeing the concept of America. Does it really matter who gets a particular job? From an outside perspective, it may very well not in the abstract. But to a particular individual's livelihood, to their family, to their wives, husbands, kids, it matters to them. But to the provincialist idea of America, those who believe in the provincial idea of America, it does matter if a native-born American gets a job versus a foreign worker who's here on a visa, or versus a foreign-born American who came over a few years ago and who was assimilated, or whatever. It does matter because they view any opportunity that's deducted from the native-born American as somehow a negative upon the whole country. But now I must ask you, again, just because someone is born here does not mean they have the American worldview. And just because someone who may have the American worldview has a job does not mean they're contributing to the country. We've created a culture of workers and not producers, of consumers and not creators within our country. I mean, as mentioned before, going all the way back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, with the induction of progressive education. And in a country of producers, of consumers, not producers, of consumers, not creators, you're not going to have someone who can benefit his nation beyond maybe jacking up the GDP every few cents. Economics is not where most workers benefit their nation. Most workers benefit their nation by being decent people. Most workers benefit their nation by building community amongst their friends and family. Most workers benefit their nation by wearing their patriotism upon their sleeve. Most workers benefit their nation by being outspoken and partaking in the political process. Most workers benefit their nation by using their God-given constitutional rights to call out corrections and abuses of authority. Most workers benefit their nations by teaching their friends and family and kids about American history and the Constitution. Most workers benefit their nation in the way that anyone else benefits their nation who is a red-blooded American, by raising their voice and using their mind to great effect and coordination with the values of our country. In other words, GDP, funnily enough, because the provincialist people will say, well, GDP is not the only thing. And yet, their argument assumes that it is a main thing. GDP is not the measure of a nation's value. GDP is a result of a nation's people understanding both its value and their value. Because if you don't understand your value, you won't be motivated to do things that would apply your value, which would be an economic position, which would be a job, which then therefore raises GDP. We always see, this debate suffers, as I mentioned before, from presuming things and seeing things in the abstract when they really should be seen in a much more nuanced way. And then you have another part of this debate, which is, I'm gonna wrap up here because there's several other parts I have to talk about, but I'm gonna wrap up here. Another part of this debate, which talks a lot about the dichotomy that has been drawn, the fault lines that have been drawn in this debate between the tech bros and the red-blooded Americans, so to speak. The tech oligarchs and the red-blooded Americans. Well, this is a false dichotomy and an oversimplification. People will say, in their articles have said this, that Elon Musk and other people who are tech bros or who run these tech companies somehow want to have these policies that benefit their bottom line and therefore create this oligarchy, which is not accountable to the people but accountable instead to economics, their economic considerations, and then hurt everyone else. The very funny thing about this is that the only reason these people are being considered oligarchs is because that reflects a certain kind of disdain for high-functioning and high-value people who happen to produce a lot and produce a lot at scales that most people won't produce at in their life, because they're leveraging their genius toward a particular effect. An oligarchy, in the most explicit sense of the word, is a kind of political organization by which a few people control almost everything. And yet, even in our country, which I would say there are a select number of people who do have a lot of influence and power and sway over our country, even in our country, these same forces, and this is the unique thing about America, can be brought to heel and are brought to heel all the time. Even the great and illustrious Elon Musk is forced to listen to his consumer base on Twitter when he makes a mistake. Even the great and illustrious Zuckerberg, the founder of Meta, the pioneer of the digital world, the king of Instagram, even he has to grovel and kiss the ring of those the people put into office, which is why he was seen hanging around Trump. Even the oligarch, if a real oligarchy is not subject to the consent of the government, a real oligarchy is not subject to the mass veto of the people. A real oligarchy is totalizing. It is an insular system that can clamp down easily on any domain of society that it wishes. And yet, we misuse terms to make ourselves, some folks misuse terms to make themselves feel more righteous about their incorrect positions. Again, there are more angles that I can hit on here, but I'm going to stop there because there are about 7 more that I have to get through. But generally, I think the whole problem with all 3 positions is, as I mentioned before, they assume a lot that is not true. They rest upon a debate that is tortured with hyperbole, that is tortured with a lack of empirical knowledge, and tortured with incorrect philosophical assumptions about the nature of man and how he exists in society. And most importantly, this is probably the biggest thing, they happen to make an issue that is not really an issue in the largest sense of the problem compared to some of the other issues we have, like for example, having a massive surveillance state or an administrative state that has hollowed out our government and its representative functions. It's not really as big of an issue as anything else is. 65,000 people a year is not really as big of an issue as our own government being against the people. But what is the issue is the confidence, the national confidence crisis. And this feeds into the national fidelity crisis that I have been talking about in various videos in the past. You can go back and look at it. Where if people don't have confidence in their government, they will oftentimes conflate that with not having confidence in their nation. And if people don't have confidence in their nation, there's less of a reason. One of the pillars that holds up the bridge of fidelity, of loyalty and duty to self, duty to people, duty to principles, duty to good ideas, that pillar falls down and the person can be resigned over to nihilism or to reactionary politics, which then therefore exacerbates their feelings of anger. Reactionary politics is not meant to make you think. It's meant to make you feel. It's meant to make you engage your passions towards a particular end and then use that end towards leverage of whatever madman, whatever propagandist, whatever charlatan, whatever con artist manages to hijack your passions and filter them through their own little propaganda machine for their own purposes. And that's a lot of what this debate is. It is a practice, a study in reactionary politics. When Vivek Ramaswamy says that Americans exalt mediocrity over merit, he's making an overgeneralization. He's making a very gross simplification rather, that I think inherently triggers a defense mechanism within people. And whenever anyone says that American culture is X, you can safely stop them and say, you're incorrect. Because you presuppose that American culture exists on one single plane of existence. You presuppose that American culture is one gigantic organism that can be measured and assessed with a few words. The reason America is different is because we rejected that paradigm. American culture, to the extent that it has any unity and cohesion within it, on a broad scale, this culture of 330 million people is a culture that prides certain moral principles that are enshrined within our founding documents and enshrined within the constitutional moral order of our nation. This is why I always talk about philosophy and first principles. Not because I want to sound smart, because I want people to understand the core of what it means to be an American, and you cannot do that without understanding philosophy. To the extent that American culture has any general similarities, it is those principles. Everything else, you will see a level of differentiation. There is no single aesthetic image to American culture. What you see an American in the mountains of North Georgia will look very different than an American in Los Angeles, but they're still Americans. There's something about them that makes them still Americans. An American that lives in southern Texas will look very different than an American that is a lobster fisher off the black sand beaches of Maine. But they're still Americans, and the customs practiced by each differing region and a person are also going to differ, but they're still Americans. So when one person says that because there was a TV show that was popular in the 2000s, like Friends or whatever, or in the 80s, and the people like that show, there is this giant monoculture that we all belong to. That's not the case. And in fact, a lot of cultural commentators will say that there once was an American monoculture, but that monoculture has fallen apart as the internet has grown because we've all become more siloed into our own communities and interests that are disconnected from a sort of broader sense of being. Well, I would say that even in those days where there appeared to be a monoculture, it wasn't universal. And it wasn't all-encompassing. If you were to, for example, go to a Mormon community in the 80s in southern Utah and try to talk to them about Michael Jackson or whatever, they might not very much care. If you were to go to a compound community out in Montana ran by a New Age prophet like Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who was prophesying the end of the world back then in the Ascendant Masters.
I am the violet flame in action in me now. I am the violet flame to light alone I bow. I am the violet flame in mighty cosmic power. I am the light of God shining every hour. I am the violet flame blazing like the sun. I am God's sacred power freeing everyone.
And talking to them about Tupac, they might not care. Or Family Matters or the Jetsons, they might not care. Because the truth is this. America and our culture is not one grand organism. America and our culture is a combination of the micro units of interaction, behavior, belief, custom, practice that are across our nation and that form to make a united whole. Out of many, one. But that one is not uniform. That one is differentiated, but it still manages to form a body, and that body is the nation. It is the nation. So, in understanding the H1B issue, we have to do a few things. Number one, disentangle economic thinking from political thinking. Number two, stop seeing people as loyal to their country or nation on the basis of them being born there. This is a very rustic view of things. Unfortunately, due to the fidelity crisis, a lot of people hate the place where they were born. And you should not assume that a native-born American is a better American than someone who just came here from China or came here from Mexico or came here from somewhere else. Number three, we have to understand that if the conversation is about immigration reform, let it be about immigration reform, but let us be holistic in how we assess immigration reform rather than being provincialist or being tribalist or assuming things that are not true. Number four, we have to be willing to look at data that may disprove our beliefs or make us question our beliefs in order to ensure we are standing on empirical ground. Judging things by symbols and abstractions and feelings and primal sensations, which is what a lot of this debate has been, does nothing more than cause anger and causes hurt feelings. But also, and finally, we have to understand that the American worker does not necessarily exist in opposition to the foreign worker. But policy should not be tailored to preference the foreign worker over the American worker. And I admit there has been that in the past, most certainly. As I mentioned before, Weinstein had a very good point. There was a policy made by the scientific establishment to create a permanent underclass of researchers within the scientific establishment. That's just true. But let us understand that sometimes how a policy is designed is not how a policy actually acts out within society. This is why I think intentions and impacts are different things that should be weighed very differently. If we were to adopt all those different things, I think we would have a much better answer to the H1B debate. And my personal opinion is the answer is very simple. Don't create policies that advantage anyone over anyone. Allow merit to be spontaneous and not politically selected. But if to the extent that merit is going to be politically selected, if at all, let that process be open-ended and let that process be limited, as the H1B process already is. Maybe there needs to be more limits, sure, but let that process be limited in a way that does not respect some tribalistic idea of the nation, but in a way that respects rather the reasonable limits that our economic capacity, our economy, and economic need dictate. As far as training more Americans or what have you, that's going to be a bigger conversation that policy can't produce. That's going to be a conversation that has to happen on the ground level. And while Ramaswamy was really crude in how he described the issue, there is an issue. And the issue must be addressed before a solution can be approached. But the issue is not necessarily that American culture is bad. Again, there is no one American culture. The issue is we are not setting up our brightest to succeed. We are not setting up our brightest to take on the world. And that is something that is a product of a top-down way of managing talent and skill. We need to abandon that, get away from that, and restore a spontaneous merit-based system. And that'll only happen when institutions change how they view education, which is going to be perhaps even greater than getting an act of Congress passed. That is my opinion on the whole ordeal, and I think this issue need not tear apart a coalition that has a chance to capitalize on some very great positive news going into the beginning of this Trump era. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe to wherever you can, and get our message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy. If you want to support me, here are some places on the screen you can do so. I have a Discord, I have a Patreon, I have a Locals. My Locals is probably the best place to support me if you want to donate financially. That is a consistent stream of income that is safe from the prying hands of any censors that may come for us as we grow, so on and so forth. So if any of these places on the screen resonate with you, they should also be in the comment section down below as well if you want to check them out. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.